All right, let's go ahead and do it. Welcome to today's training and conversation about election disinformation, what it is, how it works, and how we can find reliable information about voting. This is the fourth webinar in PEN America's Disinformation Resilience Training Series, and we are super glad to have you with us. If you want to turn on captions for Spanish or another language, just go to the bottom of your Zoom screen and click Show Options, and then simply select the language. We have goals for today's sessions. We have things that we want to accomplish. We want you to become familiar with some of the key themes, motivations, and trends of election disinformation campaigns. We'll talk about how you can recognize and sidestep false information about voting. And we'll talk about where and how to find reliable and trustworthy information about voting. During the conversation, we'll hear from experts about what they've learned from fighting election disinformation in their work. Here's how we'll be spending our 60 minutes together. We're in the middle of an introduction, and then next we'll look at election disinformation and how to be resilient. Then we'll spend about 25 minutes in conversation with the guest speakers before opening it up to audience questions for an additional 10 minutes, and then we'll wrap up at that point. I'd love to introduce the people you'll be hearing from today. First up is me. I'm Kurt Sampsel, and I'm a senior program manager at PEN America focused on helping communities cope with the challenges of disinformation. And this can look like many different things. Today, we're doing a deep dive on a specific disinformation topic, which is, of course, voting in elections. I'm joined by two distinguished guest speakers who will be sharing perspectives and learnings from their work. First up is Maritza Félix. She's the founder and director of Conecta, Arizona, which is a nonprofit news organization that provides information and community for an audience of over 100,000 people. A journalist, writer, and producer, she has been recognized with many awards, including the 2022 Cecilia Weissman Award and the 2022 Local Media Association's Innovator of the Year in the Content and Audience category. And Jen Fifield is a senior reporter for Votebeat. Votebeat is a nonprofit news organization focused on sharing accurate and nuanced information about how elections are run. In her previous role at the Arizona Republic, Jen was part of the reporting team that won the 2021 Scripps Howard Award for Distinguished Service to the First Amendment for its coverage of the multi-front effort to investigate and reject Arizona's 2020 election results. Maritza and Jen, thank you so much for joining us today. I'll say a quick note about PEN America. We are a national 501c3 nonpartisan nonprofit organization that works to protect free expression in the United States and worldwide. And part of our work is focused on disinformation. So even though we are a free speech organization, we care about disinformation because we believe it undermines our public discourse, it heightens divisions and conflict, increases polarization, and weakens the democratic system upon which our free expression rights rest. When it comes to disinformation, our focus is on empowering information consumers, community leaders, and journalists to better understand the challenges of disinformation and to develop resilience against it. This webinar is part of our Disinformation and Community Engagement program, which focuses on serving audiences and lifting up perspectives from Miami, Dallas, and Fort Worth in Texas, and Phoenix. The idea behind this work is that communities in these diverse Sunbelt regions may be experiencing similar challenges when it comes to the information environment. And those challenges can provide learning experiences for each other and for communities more broadly. So whether you're joining us from one of these three regions or somewhere else, I am confident that this session will be relevant for you. This is the fourth in a series of webinars that are designed to help people develop capacity to better navigate our information environment in this challenging and important year. In these webinars, we share best practices, resources, you'll hear from experts, and by combining a little bit of training content alongside panel conversations, we try to make sure that you'll come away with both learnings and perspectives on these issues. And by the way, if you have ideas for future webinar topics, you can share those in the survey that we'll share at the end of the webinar. As a final part of this intro section, I want to remind you about a special part of PEN America's counter disinformation work, and that is what we call empowering trusted messengers. Throughout 2024, we will be producing a set of conversation guides and trainings to help people have conversations about news, information, what they read, what they trust as part of their daily lives with people like family, friends, and acquaintances. To do this work, you don't need to be an expert on social media algorithms or propaganda techniques or artificial intelligence. You simply need to have a spirit of curiosity and helpfulness and a handful of proven techniques, which we'll share with you. We have some free conversation workshops coming up, scheduled for Miami and Dallas next week. And my colleague Henry is going to post links in the chat if you want to learn more and perhaps register to attend one of those. Again, if you want to turn on captions in another language, you can just go to the bottom of your screen, the Zoom screen, click Show Captions, and then select your language. Let's go ahead and get into our main content on election disinformation. We're going to look at a case study, some trending disinformation narratives in this moment in the election calendar, and then we'll talk about how to prepare yourself to be resilient in the face of false information. But as we get started, I want to first do a quick temperature check to see what's on your mind. You'll see a poll appear on your screen asking what worries you the most when it comes to election disinformation. So let me go ahead and deploy that poll. Oh, where is that? Oh, here it is. Sorry. Okay, sorry for the delay, folks. There's the poll. Go ahead and take about 30 seconds to select as many options as you want. Actually, sorry, to select which level of concern you have for each of the options. After 30 seconds, I will share results of the poll. We'll look at them together. Great, I'll give you another 10 seconds or so to make your selections. Voter turnout seems to be about 68%, which is pretty good. Can I give just another few seconds to complete the poll? Okay, let's go ahead and look at the results. I will end the poll, and let's take a look at what we've learned here. So it seems like people are most concerned about false claims about non-citizens, discouraging some people from voting. A lot of people said they were very concerned about that. Voters may be misled by AI-generated video, photos, or audio. Very similar. A lot of people are saying very concerned. False information about who won the election, possibly leading to conflict and violence. And if I'm looking here, I'm looking at the lightest blue, which is the not at all concerned. The one that folks seem to be the least concerned about is countries like Russia and Iran, possibly polarizing voters with false information, but still a good number of people are expressing some concern about that. So interesting, it seems like across the board, folks are pretty concerned. Thanks for sharing your responses and weighing in on that poll. I think that's pretty interesting. Okay, let's go ahead and move on a little bit. Now, we aren't going to focus much on concepts and terminology today, but I do want to spend just a minute to refresh our memories about the distinctions between misinformation and disinformation because they're relevant for our conversation. The general distinction between mis and dis focuses on intention, with misinformation being false or factually inaccurate information that's spread without the intent to deceive or mislead people. So misinformation can be an innocent mistake, on the part of someone who wants to share accurate information. When someone has spread misinformation, you'll often see that they're interested in correcting it. So that's a good thing to look out for. If someone points out a problem in a piece of information, the misinformer will often delete a post or perhaps issue a corrected statement or make an apology, and point people to correct information. So in other words, people who are sharing misinformation, they usually care about facts and the truth. They simply have made a mistake. It's not so much the case with disinformation, which is false information shared with the intent to deceive or mislead. The most important thing to know about disinformation, I think, is that it's always about achieving a goal or an outcome that would not be served as well as by accurate information. In some cases, this looks like people share claims that they know to be false, or it can look like people making claims with a reckless disregard for whether or not they're accurate or based in fact. Another way of saying this is that a disinformer shares false information because they prefer the falsehood to the fact, or they see greater utility in the falsehood than in the fact. When people share disinformation, you'll often see no interest in correcting it. Instead, people will often double down. And why shouldn't they? Really, it's not the point, whether something is factual or not. They still want to make the point they want to make or achieve the objective they want to achieve. For this reason, offering a factual correction to disinformation is usually not effective. In order to better ground this conversation about election disinformation, we're going to look at Elon Musk as a case study. This year, Musk has posted prolifically about politics and election processes, and frequently what he posts is false, conspiratorial, and designed to generate distrust in the election system. To be clear, I'm not trying to pick on Musk unfairly here, but he is a public figure. He does have a very large audience, and I believe that he is fair game because of that for attention, scrutiny, and criticism. We're going to look at 3 Elon Musk posts about the election processes specifically from September and October of this year, and I'll demonstrate some pretty basic steps for investigating and debunking those claims. So first up, on September 19th, Musk posted a video about the use of ballot drop boxes in Luzerne County, Pennsylvania, and claimed that ballot drop boxes make fraud impossible to prove. This is not true, however. Ballots cast at drop boxes go through the same verification processes as those cast through the Postal Service. But even setting that aside, it's easy to find that Musk is misrepresenting the video about drop boxes. First of all, this news video is from 2.5 years ago, so it's not just in as the original poster, Kyle Becker, claims. Now, it is true that Luzerne County officials announced in late September that they would not provide ballot drop boxes. But in statements to the press, the county manager said that her decision was due to staffing concerns and because drop boxes had become a magnet for partisan conflict. I looked all over and was not able to find her saying that she opposed drop boxes due to fraud concerns or election integrity problems. Also, actually, this decision ushered in a lot of debate and even a lawsuit in the weeks that followed. And as of when I was last following this news a few weeks ago, it looks like the county will end up using drop boxes. So to go deeper into this claim, I simply went and found that video on YouTube, the video that the original poster posted. I did a basic Google search to find news stories about ballot drop boxes being used in Luzerne County, and I read those. Here's another post. On September 26th, Musk posted a screenshot of an article about citizenship applications being approved and claimed they're importing voters, with the they kind of deliberately ambiguous. The way I investigated this claim was by simply finding and reading the news article. If you read the actual article from the LA Times, it says that the uptick in citizenship being granted is due to an effort to reduce a big backlog of applications that happened during COVID. And it directly says in the article that any implication or idea that citizenship is being granted to affect elections is baseless. But here's the thing, instead of posting an actual link to the article, Musk just posted a screenshot of the headline. And the reason is because the headline allows him to make the point he wanted to make in the way that the actual article would not. And by the way, for journalists on the webinar, this is a great reminder of why careful headline construction is so important, right? So this one was especially easy to debunk because all I did was find the article and look at it, and I found that it did not say what he was claiming. And our final example from Musk is this post from October 1st. which is a day on the way that, by the way, that he posted 76 times. I went through all of his posts that day and counted them, and there were 76. So very busy posting day for Musk. In this example, Musk reposts a post about a group of voters in Arizona whose voter registration records are in question. So he himself doesn't say much. He just says, what? But the original poster, Paul A. Cipolla, describes the situation as a massive scandal. He puts the word error in scare quotes to imply that the problem was not an error, was intentional. And below the fold there, he describes the situation as election fraud. That's the term he used. So I investigated this by reading news coverage and press releases from the Arizona Secretary of State's office. I found that this is a real problem that's affecting voters in Arizona, but reporting from the Washington Post that I found makes it clear that the Arizona officials, including the governor and the Secretary of State, were actually deeply upset and nervous about this situation, making clear that it was not purposeful in the sense that the original poster suggests. And as an administrative oversight, it does not qualify as election fraud. And as our guest speaker, Jen Fifield, has reported, there's no basis for believing that the voters in question in this case are non-citizens. And in fact, they are voters from across the political spectrum, not just one party. So again, simply reading more about the issue in question showed that the problem is just not as presented here. So let's take a different approach here and look at some of the top disinformation narratives that we're seeing at the moment. These are national narratives, by the way. And some of these we saw with the Elon Musk tweets, and others are circulating in other places. So these narratives I've assembled from my own monitoring of election disinformation narratives, as well as roundups from the organizations listed at the bottom of the screen. By far, the biggest theme this year is that non-citizen voting will sway the results, that non-citizens will vote on a large scale. Non-citizens are ineligible to vote in federal elections, and research over time has demonstrated that voting by non-citizens is very rare. Next up is the idea that administrative errors are a purposeful effort to game the system. We saw that implication with the one Elon Musk tweet, about Arizona that we just looked at. The reality is that elections are run by people, and people do make innocent mistakes, but we should assume mistakes are innocent until proven otherwise. Next up is a somewhat newer one, which is the idea that legal activities such as news coverage, legal proceedings, people making public statements, or other perfectly legal things that could possibly affect people's perceptions of elections qualify as election interference. This is an attempt to suggest illegality where there is none. And it's an obvious case of seeding things now that people can point to later as a reason to question or undermine election outcomes. Number 4 is a classic. People often call for voter ID and claim that without voter ID laws, election officials cannot verify voter eligibility. But 36 states already have voter ID laws, including swing states like Arizona, Georgia, Wisconsin, and the remaining the remaining states do verify eligibility using other methods. Next up, there are still widespread claims that electronic voting equipment is not trustworthy, and this has led to a nationwide movement to tabulate ballots by hand, despite the fact that substantial research has shown that hand counts take more time and are less accurate than using tabulation equipment. And then we have a few that are related to election results. I've seen frequently this idea that if results take a long time to report, that's a sign of wrongdoing, but that's not the case. For instance, Pennsylvania law doesn't allow administrators to begin processing mail ballots until election day, meaning that they have to wait to process millions of ballots until the exact same moment when they also need to run an in-person election, making for a very slow process. And then the idea that an update in vote totals that seems to change which candidate is in the lead qualifies as a spike that is suspicious and could be evidence of fraud. This is also not the case. We saw in 2020 this phenomenon that some folks called the red mirage, which was due to the fact that most Republicans preferred to vote on election day, while many Democrats preferred to vote by mail. So first reporting the in-person vote totals meant that the results appeared to change as more ballots were being counted. The reality, of course, is that there really is no winner until all of the eligible votes have been counted. I do want to say a quick word about the partisan quality of many of the examples and the trends and narratives that we've looked at today. Although currently many of the false claims about election processes are coming from political conservatives, it's important to stress that there's nothing intrinsically conservative or liberal about using false claims about elections for political purposes. For example, when Stacey Abrams lost her 2018 bid for governor in Georgia, although she acknowledged her loss, she did not concede because she felt that the election was not proper due to voter suppression and problems with voting machines. Those were her claims. However, subsequent lawsuits and investigations did not find violations of law or errors that would have changed the outcome. Similarly, after losing her 2016 election for president, Hillary Clinton made remarks casting doubt on the validity of the election, often pointing to Russian hacking and influence operations. Now, although the Mueller report confirmed that there were Russian campaigns, subsequent analysis has suggested that probably their effect on voters and voters' decisions was minimal. So I share these examples not out of a spirit of both sidesism or to suggest that there's an equivalence or everything is just the same, but simply to remind us all that disinformation is a tool that really can be used by anyone, and we shouldn't excuse it regardless of our political views. Now that we've looked at some examples and trending narratives in disinformation, I think a lot of us are faced with this question of why. So with our definition of disinformation, we saw that disinformation has an intent to mislead or deceive. But why would someone want to mislead or deceive? Typically, it's because it's in the service of someone's personal or political objectives. And here are some of the most common goals of election disinformation campaigns. One is to face and cope with electoral disappointment. Any of us who has ever voted and had our candidate or issue not succeed knows what it feels like to be disappointed and to be kind of seeking out excuses. Those examples that we just looked at from Stacey Abrams and Hillary Clinton, to me, kind of smack of this coping with electoral disappointment reasoning. There's also evidence that election disinformation can be used to mobilize voters. So depending on the specific messaging, false claim can mobilize favored voters through fear, anger, vengeance, a desire to right wrongs that are perceived. And then, of course, it can have a similar effect on other voters, right? It can discourage participation, again, depending on the messaging and the specific claims of some voters through intimidation, cynicism, a sense of I don't know what to think about things. Of course, it can also set the stage to question election outcomes and reject results. You can point to claims or things that you lifted up in the past to say, this is a reason why we're suspicious. And similarly, it can provide a basis for lawsuits, for new legislation, and so on. So you might understandably think that, if only people like Elon Musk and others could learn a little bit more about these topics, gosh, maybe they would just get a different perspective and they wouldn't post some of these things. But in my opinion, that's a bit naive. It would kind of assume that Musk wants to know the truth and is trying to inform his audience. And unfortunately, I don't think that that's the case with many of these posts. Disinformers, like I suggested earlier, are likely to continue because disinformation serves a need. So in the face of disinformation, what can we do as voters? We have 3 suggestions to share with you. First, you should make sure to connect with your local and state election authorities to get official and local information about how to participate. Politics often feels national. It's often talked about nationally. We consume national news. And it can be easy to forget that elections are local and they're run differently in different states, counties, and cities. So it's really valuable to get information from your local election authority. For me, I live in Camden County, New Jersey. So that's the Camden County Board of Elections, whose website you can see here on the screen. A website like this is a great way to get official information about voting from the real experts and with zero politics. Remember that in addition to just getting information about voting, you can also sign up to be a poll worker, excuse me. You can attend board meetings. You can attend public testing and demonstration of election equipment and other things. Next, going beyond your local election department, you should seek out information that's reliable and trustworthy about the election system from organizations like Conecta Arizona and Votebeat, the 2 organizations represented by our guest speakers today. In general, you should look for sources of information about voting and the election system that are not focused on politics, and sometimes that can be hard to do. So for sure, you should not assume information from any candidate, political party, or campaign will be fully accurate or transparent or trustworthy. Votebeat is a great resource that provides both national news about the election system as well as state-based coverage for Arizona, Texas, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. So for instance, to investigate and debunk the claims from Elon Musk, I used Votebeat resources, but also resources from local news and governments, including the ones that you see here on the screen. For instance, I used this TV station for the Scranton, Pennsylvania area, that LA Times article, Washington Post article, and the Arizona Secretary of State's office. To be clear, I'm not endorsing these news sources or saying every item they publish will be accurate or be trustworthy, but I'm sharing them as examples of where you might be able to go to find information about elections that isn't focused on politics and has gone through processes of fact-checking and verification. That's the way that I use them. So reflect on what kind of similar sources might exist in your city and your state. And finally, a simple but powerful action that you can take to get ahead of election disinformation is to make a voting plan. Research has shown that people who make a voting plan are more likely to successfully follow through. Planning in advance for when and how and where you will vote is an effective way to overcome any number of possible barriers, and that includes disinformation, which often kind of crops up to throw people off by introducing a new idea in a vulnerable moment. So if you have a plan and you stick to it, you will be more resilient. Just think about things like verifying that you're registered, thinking about what voting method you'll use, if you know who and what you'll vote for, where your designated polling place or drop box is, when you will physically go to vote, what information you'll need to show, like ID, how you'll account for logistics with your work schedule, things like that, and how you'll prepare just in case voting maybe takes more time than you would expect. All right, I hope that this overview has been helpful. At this point, we're going to go a little bit deeper into the ins and outs of election disinformation by hearing from our guest speakers, Maritza, Félix, and Jen Fifield. All right, we're going to start with Jen. So Jen, you are the elections and voting reporter for Votebeat for the state of Arizona. I'm always curious about how people explain their work to strangers. You're having that experience. You meet someone sitting next to you on an airplane, and they ask, "What do you do for a living?" So, how do you describe the work that you do, Jen?
Oh, sometimes I pretend I'm not a reporter at all. No, I'm kidding. It depends on the person. Well, at VoteBeat, we are a nonprofit newsroom. We are aimed at telling the nuanced truth about elections, which I say nuanced because it's not often as exciting as you might think on either side. It's often very nuanced, and our stories focus on doing a lot of explaining so people fully understand issues. We track election law, pay attention to real election mistakes that are then going to probably spiral into some misinformation, and, watchdog voter access, all of that good stuff.
Hmm, thanks for sharing that. And we looked at that screen that has the list of disinformation narratives that are circulating right now. And I'd be curious to get your thoughts about which of those narratives have stood out to you the most, and maybe what narratives you're seeing that could be different than some of the ones that I covered.
I had something else to start with, but I thought it was interesting in the poll that most people said they were worried about violence. And I wanted to talk about that a little bit,
Yeah.
because violence, when it comes to what happens if the outcome goes one way or the other in November. And, one thing that may be reassuring is that election offices across the country since 2020 have realized there's a threat and bulked up their security, bulked up the way they work with local law enforcement, and added like we have a full-on gate here in Maricopa County that's very tall that people cannot jump over if they tried, and stuff like that. Like, we are prepared and way more prepared than 2020 for realizing that something might happen. So I think
Mm,
that's almost part of the misinformation on the other side, is that kind of stirring people up, making people concerned about violence. And that's fine. We can all prepare, but there are people working on this. The other big one here is the non-citizen voting piece, and you talked a little bit about the real error that occurred here with 218,000 registered voters who were found to not have provided proof of citizenship when they should have. The court ruled we do not have to do anything about that before November, but some people are trying to get the list of those voters through a public records request. The Secretary of State's concerned about threats that might come from that. And we're seeing real misinformation about what that means for the election. Does that mean that all these people are non-citizens? And could that be used in a future lawsuit if they do get the names on the list, even though it's not true that we don't know if they're citizens or not? So those kind of stick out to me as the main ones. I'm watching Dropbox watchers right now. We had a big, surge in Dropbox watching in 2022. And that caused a lot of misinformation about ballot harvesting and fraudulent ballot sweeps where people were going and collecting people's ballots and then casting them. I think that might come up again. I'm hoping it doesn't, and I haven't seen it yet, and early voting started last week. But all of these things about the real election problems that kind of turn into misinformation in one way or the other. It's good to know about them. And if you don't know the full truth, like Kurt gave all those resources for how to figure it out, at least ask people questions about, how they know something. So that's kind of what I'm watching here.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jen. I mean, I think it really is important to know about the very real problems that come up in election administration. I mean, it's a huge undertaking to run basically like 8,000 simultaneous elections in local jurisdictions across the country all at once, right? And mistakes do happen, and it's important to not, pretend like everything is perfect, right? I'm curious with regard to the 218,000 folks whose registrations are kind of like flagged or in this status right now. Do you know, are they going to have to show verification of citizenship after November?
Yeah, that's the plan. The court said it's way too soon to disenfranchise these people. They've all been living in the state since before 1996. We believe that they're citizens because they attested to it under federal law. That's what you do when you register to vote. And so let's let them vote in November and then figure it out after that. I think the Secretary of State's office is going to have a very easy way for people to provide documents. They are working on that now. So, but it is one of those problems that came up at the worst time for our state, in the worst place. So it really wasn't great.
Yeah, that's part of the reason why that Washington Post story was so interesting, was getting to see those leaders in Arizona behind the scenes saying, really how upset they were about it, the problem and the timing. Thanks so
Exactly.
much. And Maritza, you're the founder and director of Conecta Arizona. Could you talk about some of the work that Conecta is doing to support informed voting for your audience?
Of course, buenos dias. It's a pleasure to be here with you. So, if you're not familiarized with us, Conecta Arizona is a news you can use organization that connects trans-border communities using WhatsApp, and we provide good information, resources. We do a lot of fact checking. We do a lot of like informal but very informative pieces for our audience. And we focus a lot about immigrants, first generation, second generation, people who go back and forward in the border, people who are US citizens and they're living in Mexico maybe, and they come and vote during this election. And the process in Mexico and the process in the United States is very different. So we do a lot of explaining why the person who got most of the votes doesn't necessarily win an election for the presidency. So things like that, those are the things that we have been like addressing since 2020 when we launched. But everything that we do in Conecta Arizona starts with the listening. So we have
Mm,
listening sessions that we call cafecitos in WhatsApp. Now we're doing live events, so we're meeting with the community. We just recently did a town hall in Spanish with Secretary of State, with people who were representing different areas that are very important for our community to go out and vote, or the topics that are more impressive for them to actually take an action. And what we have seen is our community has been overlooked and they were underserved like on purpose for so long that they're very disengaged from the system. What
mm,
we have been seeing as well is that the new generation, those kids of immigrants that have been like being part of the change since 2010 in Arizona till now, those are the ones that are actually taking action and mobilizing the older generation and the newer generation. And we are always fighting with mis and disinformation. We get lost in translation quite often as Spanish
mm.
speakers. And there's a lot of people that take advantage of that. So we're always like trying to reinforce the message, be very mindful of the words that we do. We do very basic guides. It's saying it's like, this is what's going on. Probably the translation that you're looking about the proposition in your balance are very difficult to understand in English. And can you imagine in Spanish? It's very, very confusing. So we do
Mm.
a lot of translation and trying to explain what everything means to our community or who's running, because just having a Latino last name doesn't necessarily means that it aligns with you and your family. So we're trying to put a face to the names, to explain the values, to do guides, to meet communities. And something that we have been doing for these elections is going to rural communities where community Spanish speakers that have been voting here for generations, that they have been so ignored, they're completely disengaged, and this time they have no motivation to actually to participate in the elections. So we're going over there and listening to them and seeing what we can do to actually make them go to the polls and vote on November 5th.
Great. Thank you so much, Maritza. And I appreciated that you highlighted that one of the things that's, really distinctive about Conecta Arizona as a news and information source is that you don't just provide information to audiences, but you also give people a chance to be listened to and to share their thoughts. And, as somebody who spends a lot of time listening, I'd be curious to hear what are some of the election conspiracies or concerns that you've heard people ask about the most. You shared some of the kind of challenges that people are facing in terms of engaging and being familiar with the rules and everything. But I guess I'm curious about what kind of concerns or disinformation you've seen that's circulating among some of the folks who make up your audience.
Obviously, we have heard about the undocumented immigrants voting in this election, but since my community is very immigrant based, so they know better. So that's good. So we haven't
Mm,
had to do a lot of fact checking on that because some of them have gone into the system if they have the possibility to do so. So they know how it works. So you don't fool them quite easily. But talking about immigration as well, there's this conspiracy that USCIS is taking longer to actually to process the petitions for citizenship this year, especially just to prevent those new immigrants from voting in this election.
mm,
So we have asked USCIS, we have asked for the records. Obviously, they have a backlog of work, obviously, because since the pandemic. So you cannot actually predict, or we cannot actually confirm there is a relationship between election year and the backlog that they have with immigration cases, specifically for citizenship. There is a lot of voter intimidation, especially in rural communities like Cochise, like Yuma, like Casa Grande, Coolidge, those places. They're a little bit more conservative. They're using like the fear to actually prevent people to going out of vote. So we're going over there and we say,
mm,
no, nothing is going to happen to you if blah, 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 blah. Elections are safe. We're still fighting with the 2020 voter fraud. And it's like people were 4 years apart. It's like there's been some like research, there has been investigations. There is nothing to prove that it was actually that happening in Arizona.
mm,
And then there is a lot of people who are US citizens and they come back and forward. So they live here for a little bit and then they live in Mexico for a little bit. And there was a campaign saying that since they don't live here, they don't have the right to vote, but actually
mhm,
they do. So you can vote, you can
mm,
participate in elections regardless where you are, if you're a US citizen. And another conspiracy theory is like if somebody in your house is undocumented, you shouldn't be voting because the whole household doesn't have legal status in the US. So those are the things that we have been fighting a lot. And obviously AI. So this is our first
mm,
contact, like first election that actually we're talking AI like we should. And obviously fact checking, like the images is easier and text obviously is easier, whatever we see in social media, but audio is very complicated to actually know if that's real or not. So we have been partnering up with Secretary of State and trying to address this issue and then create processes to build trust. And the best way of fighting AI, the bad use of AI, is meeting in person, is going back to an
mm,
analog and having those conversations in making these figures like Secretary of State who speaks Spanish, thankfully, to the communities that we're serving.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. Gonna move to you now, Jen. Jen, you're an active social media user. You're still on Twitter despite the challenges with it. And I've seen you respond to and debunk many, many false claims and conspiracies about elections on Twitter over the years. I would be super curious to hear what that experience has been like for you and what you've learned. Particularly, I'm curious about, what have you discovered about people's openness or closedness about taking in new information? What works with people? What have you found?
Yeah, so I am a super snarky person, and so it has been a challenge for me on Twitter and any other social platform to tone that down because I found that when you respond in a rude manner, you give people snark and you don't give them anything to back up what you're saying, you're actually making it worse. And so if people like proof, link to full documents. If I'm writing about a ruling, as soon as I tweet, if someone's asking for the full document, I've just started putting the full document there, Uh, when you see something, you're not just going to say this is false. That's going to make it even worse too. So you have to give people the why. I was just reading a very interesting new study out from researchers at Yale and University of San Diego, where they found that if you just tell people the election results are going to come in late this year, their distrust for elections goes up, even if you're giving them a warning. If you give them a video explaining why, having an election official explain the process for counting ballots and why election results are going to be delayed, that person's distrust that they just felt is gone. They're fine.
Hmm.
And so any time you can provide real facts and real information, it really helps to reach the people who are at least open to learning facts. There's a small percentage of people who aren't, but my goal is never to reach those people.
Hmm. Yeah, I appreciate your point of sharing materials and guides and resources and research so that people can kind of find the facts for themselves, right? Because I think we all have had that experience of having someone just kind of pop up and tell you you're wrong or this is incorrect, and it doesn't feel good, right? And there's a certain kind of knee-jerk reaction to resist or to have a negative reaction to that. Whereas if you say instead, like, well, here's a thing you can look at to learn more about this, I understand why that would be helpful and effective. And I'm curious, Maritza, you've also done work to debunk some conspiracies about elections, but something that's kind of distinctive about your work with Conecta is that you do it in more kind of private spaces, not secret spaces, but more kind of closed spaces, not the public space of Twitter, and with real-time conversation back and forth as opposed to posting on a public social media platform. So I'd be curious for you too, Maritza, to share what you have learned from the experience of pointing people toward accurate information about voting.
So what we have done is, well, part of our mission is to bring back dialogue to journalism. So we have created spaces we can actually have conversations with the community that we're serving. So actually have these two-way conversations all the time. We like to generate conversations. And we have a diverse group of people that is prevent us to becoming like an echo chamber. And that's very, very magical for me because it is really important. Everybody can create a WhatsApp group. Moderating is like a completely different thing. There are some days that I think that I'm gonna have a heart attack when we're like moderating topics like about abortion or Prop 314 in Arizona about immigration and how do you tackle that, or political violence. We had a cafecito yesterday just to talk about how identify political violence. And then we have had different elections this year that are very important for our immigrant community, like the Mexican elections, the Venezuelan elections. Now we're going to have the US elections. But
Mm,
something that we realize when we're listening is people, they don't want to feel dumb when they are asking a questions. So when you're creating that space that no question is dumb, everybody can send it in the group or they can send it to us and we will do the fact check and then going back to them. And that we're not putting like a target on their back saying that this is a person who actually believed that this was happening. So that is very open and very safe for them to express what is on their mind or whatever they're reading or listening to or seeing on social media. It is very, very important. So we are very mindful on how do we talk to people. And for that, we have been training ourselves. So we have a huge team of support that we have. Sometimes is mental health specialists that help us how to navigate a difficult conversation with our community when we know that we're going to talk about abortion, for example. Or yesterday that we were talking about political violence, there were some people that are from Venezuela, they just recently felt it. And there are some triggers for them that if you don't use the right words, you're going to create just another wall between them, and they're not going to feel safe to start sharing. So this is what we're doing, and it's nothing new. People wants to be listened. People wants to have a say. People wants to participate and say and feel something. And then we use a lot of sense of humor. We realize that when people are in a good mood, they're more receptive and more eager to have difficult conversations. And then we use WhatsApp. So it's like you cannot hear the tone of voice if not, it's not an audio message. You cannot see exactly their faces that they're doing when you're like talking about something. So we needed to be fluent in English, Spanish, emoji, and GIFs so we can actually get to that community that we're serving.
Thank you so much for that. So kind of related to that, um, and by the way, we're going to get to audience questions in just 2 or 3 minutes. So if you have questions for Maritza or Jen, feel free to go ahead and type those into the chat, and we will get to those in a few minutes. But just to kind of transition from what you were saying, Maritza, this is a question for both you and Jen. Based on your experiences with debunking, I'm really curious about what you would recommend or say for those of us who find ourselves sometimes in this experience where you're talking to a friend or a family member who shares disinformation or is afraid about conspiracy or something about the election system. Let's say that they don't want to vote using a voting machine because they don't think that they're secure. I'd be curious to hear what tips you would share, maybe on top of the ones you already did share, which were really good, that I could keep in mind for, how to respond to something like this to someone who I care about and who I don't want to, make mad, and I don't want them to feel bad or feel like they've made a mistake. What would you suggest to some do's and don'ts?
Well, a hard part of like debunking someone you love live is like you don't want to like act like a know-it-all. And so like what I like to do is just ask them questions. Where did you hear that? Do you know who those people were influenced by? Why do you trust them over someone like an election official? Or over, like your local reporter who is literally there in your neighborhood researching this. So just ask questions, rather. And typically after a few questions, you get into a great conversation about like who can we trust, who can't we trust, that kind of thing. The other thing I wanted to say is like, if you're listening to this webinar, it's because you like really do care about the process. And I just think that there are groups that people don't know about. There's Citizens Engagement Beyond Voting here that does like weekly discussions. They're actually doing like a ballot fill out seminar, which is really fun. And like there's different groups you can join to actually learn more about the process itself, like League of Women Voters, or there's a deputy registrar program. So you can find ways to get involved, to educate yourself more so that you can actually make change in the community. And hopefully that will resonate into less questions and less misinformation too.
Thanks for sharing that. Your remarks made me think about a few years ago when I served as a poll worker, and I only did it one time. I should do it more. But it was such an interesting and difficult experience. It's such a long day, and it really gave me a lot of respect for the people who, run elections at your, local precinct polling place. Um, what would you say, Maritza, in terms of tips or suggestions for talking to someone I care about?
The first thing is like trust. Building trust takes time. So you don't want you shouldn't be expecting to change somebody's mind one day to another, but because that's not going to happen. So
Hmm.
investing in is the same when people are just parachuting in our communities just because they have like a purpose. Like right now, elections, everybody, Arizona is really hot, everybody wants to be here. But this is not how it works. You actually need to build trust, and that's the first thing that we want to do. and use some of the techniques like difficult conversations or hard negotiations, because this is kind of a negotiation. It doesn't need to be a transaction, but it's having the openness to listen, to actually understand, not just to respond to whatever they're listening. Because there is this new study that the Digital Institute of the America just released, saying that, for example, Latinos, we fell on mis and disinformation, not just because we don't know better, but it's because it aligns with our perspective and our ideology. So you need to understand the motivation of why people are like falling for these things. And then reaffirm a positive message. So these difficult conversations, they don't need to be brutal, or you don't need to be mad or just responding or in a bad mood. You can actually use positive message. You can use this opportunity with your family members or your co-workers sometimes to reclaim and reaffirm those narratives that we're working on. And then another thing that is very, very important is to respect the awkward silences that the conversation is going to have, because it's going to have some awkward silences. And for that, you need to prepare yourself, being exposed to different point of views that necessarily they're not the same as you, so you can understand the motivation, so you can know exactly where to pull the good information and when to say it, so it doesn't look like you are imposing someone. And then there's going to be people that are not willing to change, are not willing to listen. They're always going to be like sharing mis and disinformation because they're like really into that. I know a lot of Latinos, they still think that eventually we're going to end up eating cats and dogs just because. And it is weird, but this is how it works. So when that happens, just follow the 24-hour rule. Just have that heated conversation to cool off and understand that if in 24 hours you still need to have this conversation again with that person, if you feel that you're gonna get somewhere, do it. And if not, just let it settle down. It is very, very hard, but you're not gonna be able to convert everybody.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I think those are great suggestions. Athena asks an interesting question in the chat. They're saying, disinformation is an issue in the United States, of course, but also around the world. There is extremism, political violence, authoritarianism across the world, right? And something that's distinctive about 2024, as a lot of people have pointed out, is just how many elections have been held in different nations around the world, right? We think about it here in the US as a US election year, but really it's been a global election year. And so I'd be curious, Jen and Maritza, what are you aware of in terms of how kind of learning and coordinating maybe is happening globally when it comes to addressing some of these issues? Maritza, of course, I know that some of your audience and some of the folks you work with are in Mexico and Venezuela and other places. And, Jen, maybe you have a sense of this as well.
Was going to let Maritza go first because this is a really difficult question. But you know, I've it's so funny. Norwegian reporters have been here since 2020. Every press conference I've been at, major one. There's such an international interest in our elections, and all I can say is like you might have local outlets who are covering our election system well, who are reporting on it well, and sharing those resources for people, in your language or to your community from making clear that this is an interest in your community, but there might be local resources that are looking into our election system too.
Thanks, Jen.
For us, something that has been really helpful is like we have one foot in Arizona and the other one in those places where our community are coming from. So we have trusted messengers in Venezuela, in Colombia, Peru, Guatemala, Mexico. So we know what they're talking about, the US elections and what is going on in their communities, so we can understand better why our community is voting or participating or not participating in this electoral process during that time. It is hard because there is not just about creating and distributing content or good journalism or resources guide is understanding the cultural context. Where are we coming from? What are the motivations for us of being part of that society? Are we planning on staying here on the long run, even though we do have dual citizenship, or are we planning on always going back to the place? How invested are we going to be in this society? So those are the motivations that sometimes when we're working on this topic as a general idea that we don't take in consideration, and those are the windows that are open for mis and disinformation to get into one family or one individual that is willing to participate. And then, for example, there are I've been talking to a lot of Venezuelans that have been here forever. So, and they were thinking about voting certain way before their election. Then whatever happened in Venezuela, and after that, they changed their mindset about how they're going to vote because they don't want the US to become a new Venezuelans. And even though it's proven that it's not going to be like that either way, but there is a lot of things. It's like that thing, it was just thing that happened in their home country that is actually affecting how we do it. And that's how New York is changing. And that's how Arizona is changing because of those immigrants and their cultural perspectives and backgrounds.
Hmm. Thanks, Maritza. I appreciate that overview. And Keeler asked this interesting question about speed. Speaking of speed, by the way, I recognize we're getting close here to the end of the hour, but I'd love to get to these other two questions here in the chat. And Keeler asks, to what extent does it really matter if you're responding to disinformation or false claims quickly? Is the speed something that's really important, or is that maybe not so important?
Yeah, I don't know how to answer that. That's something I've been trying to figure out for 4 years. How do you quickly figure out the facts about something that's spreading? And it is really crucial that you do it quickly. But I don't know. I don't know how to prevent it from spreading before you do that, other than just all of these new fact check organizations that are popping up everywhere, which are really exciting to me.
So to some degree, you're kind of always going to be following a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's just like cooking. So you need to prep all your like cooking ingredients before you start cooking. So for example, if people talk about the undocumented immigrants voting, that's not new. So we already have like the fact checking done before, and so we send it right away. But there are things that are gonna take a little bit longer. For example, yesterday the One Direction person who died in Argentina, there were tons of fake videos, and it was like we never think about fact checking that, but that's something that we do, and it takes a little bit more time. And we say it's like this is gonna take a little bit longer, and people, but if we get back to them, they're happy to do so. But it needs to be kind of like fast. If there's something urgent, if there is something it can wait a little bit more, we take more time. So actually we can like check and double check and triple check everything that we're gonna be sharing.
Thanks for that. And maybe as the final question, Kyle asks this interesting question, after you publish something that's maybe a little bit controversial, a little bit touchy, how do you manage your inbox and public feedback? I would imagine that Jen has experiences to share here for sure.
I just published a project on verifying mail ballots yesterday, and my inbox, my responses have been great. I actually take the time. I stayed up late responding to everything. I think it's really important to connect with the people you're trying to reach. And if you don't do that, I don't know what the point of the job is. So, like it's very important to look at the misinformation spreading. And if there's something that emerges, we were monitoring all day for how people were interpreting our piece. And we wanted to actually write about that after the fact if it happened.
Maritza,
For
anything you'd
us,
add?
when it's something good, it's like they're very slow to respond. But whenever we write about Trump, oh my God, that's when we're fact checking, for example, that's a specifically message. It's like our inbox is gonna get crazy, but we do take up time to respond to everybody. And I'm honest, we do receive your message. This is what we think we value, and we appreciate your opinion. This is the things that we like, the fact check that we did, or this is and we send it. Well, we do reply. to everybody in WhatsApp, via email, social media, Messenger, TikTok. It's crazy. But we're trying to use the same platforms where mis and disinformation is being spread to combat those. And it takes a lot of time and a lot of humility to actually be able to read and not want to hit anyone during that process.
That's incredible. Thanks to both of you, and thanks for the work you do. It sure does sound laborious, right? Thanks to everybody in the audience for asking your thoughtful questions. Let's go ahead and wrap things up. By the way, if we didn't get to your question, I put my email address in the chat and you'd be welcome to share it with me via email. So my colleague Henry is going to drop a survey for you in the chat. I'd really appreciate if you could just take a quick moment to click on that survey link and to make sure that that link works. Your feedback is super important to us, so we'd really appreciate it if you can help us out by sharing your thoughts about what was most useful for you, what kinds of things you might do differently as a result of some of the things that you got exposed to today. And also, we'd love to hear if you have ideas that we could consider for future trainings like this. All right, and I see Henry has added the survey in there. Awesome. Thank you so much. So thanks again for joining us, and thanks to Jen and Maritza for being so generous with their time and their thoughts at a very busy time in the calendar, right? You can always reach out to me and to learn more about PEN America's work on disinformation resilience at the addresses that you see on the screen. Thanks so much for joining us, and hope we'll catch you next time. Take care, everybody.